Hi, so today we're going to be going over a reading response off the book called Children and Their Art. It is by Michael Day and Al Hurwitz, and it is all about art assessment. So at the beginning of the chapter, the authors go over a bunch of different definitions of different types of assessments, and those are going to be assessment in general, evaluation, standardized assessments, alternative assessments, formative assessments, summative assessments, and tests. Since assessment is the basis of this entire chapter, I'm going to go ahead and give you a direct quote from the book. It can be found on page 372. The definition of assessment is the method or process of gathering information about people, programs, or objects for the purpose of evaluation. Notice in that definition, assessment is for the purpose of evaluation. The text also mentions how it's a common mistake to interchange the words assessment and evaluation, but the definition of evaluation is actually more of a judgment on the overall project. So the value, the beauty, how good the art is, or successful rather, in terms of an art classroom. Now that we have the groundwork covered, I'm going to go ahead and go into some specific kinds of assessments. The first one is a standardized assessment, and that is checking or assessing a group, a large number of people, like a large population, all under the same criteria. So standardized tests would be taking all the same questions, applying them to a large number of people, and checking for the same kinds of results. Now, almost the exact opposite is alternative assessments, and in these the assessments typically try to avoid the general pen to paper, test taking, essay writing kinds of checks. It's more free range in terms of you can do portfolios, games, projects, worksheets, performances, things that are more creatively geared and can be taken in a range of different directions. Now I'm going to go into the difference between formative assessments and summative assessments, and the basic difference of these is basically why you're getting these assessments and at what point during the art project are you making these assessments. So formative assessments typically take place in the middle of the project or throughout. These are checkpoints to see where the students are, how they're learning, how effective the module is or the teacher is being, what needs to be adjusted and taken into account. And the summative assessment is at the end of the project, doing a holistic check of how effective the project was in hindsight, seeing how it all went through and how much the students learned. Did it align with the unit or lesson objectives, as well as that judgment of the final project or an evaluation. Finally, while a test isn't necessarily a genre of assessment, I wanted to go ahead and include a quote of the definition because it does come up a lot in this chapter and does have its time and place, and it's very important to know exactly what it is in order to utilize it properly. So this definition is also found on page 372, and it says a test is an instrument or systematic procedure involving a series of questions or other means of measuring the skills, knowledge, intelligence, capacities, behaviors, or aptitudes of an individual or group. Now, this can be taken in a range of different ways and in a range of different directions, but it's important to know when and why you want to use a test and under what kind of assessment strategy you're trying to use. One of the next few things you'll find in the chapter are that Day and Hurwitz included 5 basic questions for following a formative assessment. I'm going to name the 5 and explain to you how these relate to a COE or a Common College of Education lesson plan format. So those 5 questions we're going to go into are going to include who will do the evaluation, what is being evaluated, who will be evaluated, what is the range of the evaluation, and finally, what is the purpose or function of the assessment. So question number 1, who will do the evaluation? Luckily, in the COE lesson plan format, there is a place to fill out the format of the formative assessment and the summative assessment. So depending on what the procedures are in your lesson plan, you can find the formative plan and the summative plan to find out where the instructions for who and how the assessment is going to be taking place. Next is what is being evaluated. So based on what the students got right and wrong in the opening and introduction display of prior knowledge in the lesson plan, the success of the lesson objectives and the lesson goal is what should be measured and evaluated to see if the lesson plan was successful or not in terms of the teacher's actions and the student's absorption of knowledge. Next is who will be evaluated. So at the beginning of the COE lesson plan, there will be an area to write down the age and the grade and the subject of the lesson. That will tell you who will be participating in the assessment. However, at the very end of the lesson plan, there's also an area for you to include what's called the assessment accommodations and modifications portion, and that is to explain if there's any changes that need to be made on the assessment process in terms of specific students that may need some modifications for specific learning specifications or other reasons in an IEP that they may have filed. Next is what is the range of the evaluation, and that just means, is it one person, is it a class, is it the whole school, how many people are being evaluated at once. And luckily, again, in the COE, there is an entire area laid out just for grouping structures, and this will show how students will work with, whether it be by themselves, what size of group, how that will be separated and laid out, and depending on where students land in that project, that might determine how big the evaluation is and if it's going to be one-on-one with the teacher and the student, if it's going to be a class discussion. If you follow those instructions, it should take you all the way to the evaluation describing what the setting and grouping of the evaluation should be. And finally, what is the purpose or function of the assessment itself? So like I mentioned earlier, there is an area for the formative assessment and there is an area for the summative assessment. So the purpose of the formative assessment is to measure the learner's progress toward achieving the learning objectives, while the summative assessment is really focusing on if the entire goal of the lesson was met and where the specific learning targets that are also outlined at the beginning of your COE, if those were met as well. The book also provides some examples for some assessments in the classroom, and those can be found between pages 375 and 378. The one I preferred is called I'm on Video, A Lesson on Self-Portrait, and that's the one I would probably most likely use in my own classroom. I really enjoyed it because the way the assessment played out is a very constructive and positive conversation between the students in a group setting. They're interacting with each other, and the way it's set up is the student will make a collage or self-portrait, and it's supposed to be matched up with a video that's shown in class with a activity that kind of mirrors the project, and they have to match those together. I think that's really interesting because it's focusing on the effectiveness of the piece working as a self-portrait, but it isn't so much focused on the representation of the face. It's just enough for students to understand who should go together so that the assessment isn't so much based on that aspect of like the likeness of the person. I like how conceptual it gets and how open-ended and constructive this conversation can be. Also, there is a nifty list of methods for assessment of student progress of art. That's found on page 379 through 384, and I'm going to choose 3 that I think really would go well in elementary and middle school, but I really enjoyed 6 of them. So the 3 that I think would be extremely effective for either grade would be observation, interview, and portfolio. I think observation would be most effective in the elementary school setting where there isn't so much of a rigid definition of what needs to get done all the time. Sometimes they just need to explore the materials, and participation and active learning is enough for them to be having a positive assessment. Interview is good. I think no matter the age, it's really important to sit down and check with your students one-on-one or in small groups to see where they are and understand on a personal level how much they're progressing or where they're struggling. And finally, portfolio. Again, any age, it's always a good idea to have all of the students work in one place so you can see the progression from the beginning of the year or semester to the end, the writings, the notes. I think it's just a really good practice to have all of this information to be drawn upon at the blink of an eye. If anything happens, if any questions are risen from the parents and their progress, principal, anything, it's all there. And other things I really liked was the checklist. Again, for elementary school, that's really good. It's a clear way to keep things on track, even with all the kids running around. You have a clear form of assessment, even when there isn't a setting of like clear grades. Discussion is good. I think this is more useful in middle school in terms of serious and in-depth conversations, but I think in elementary school too, it's good to have your students talk things out. And you can, even if you're evaluating one student in particular, you can kind of get a range of where other students are depending on what they're saying in the group discussion. And one that I think would work specifically for middle school, maybe elementary if it's a simple thing, but for middle school mostly would be performance, and that was having students perform a specific task, teaching them how to mix paints, how to do certain um, techniques with the medium, and that is their assessment. I feel like elementary students could do it. I think it's a possibility for them and it's a good exercise, but it wouldn't really be fair to grade them on that quite yet. It really isn't necessary to put them in a test taking perspective in terms of their performance in art. I think that can be a transition into higher level classes, which we would kind of encounter in middle school. Alright, and finally, I'm going to go and end this video out with my most salient takeaways from this chapter. And I think the most important thing that I got out of this chapter was how positively they spoke about teaching children how art can be something that can be learned. If you teach art in a way that can be assessed in a comfortable setting, it won't be alarming to students. For example, if you're teaching your students something like texture, and you explain this is different textures, we're going to explore the textures, then you provide them with a project and explained if you have 4 textures, you did great, you did awesome, and we can move on, extrapolate on how these projects can improve and what was done right and all these different things. The stress is decreased and your students learned about texture. There's just some things that can be taught in that way. Now that isn't everything, and they explained that, but I really like how they touched upon how just rewarding and comforting that can be. Is some technical things can be taught that way, and the connection between art and other subjects can kind of comfort them. Art can be a bit daunting for some students. It's creative, and while some students may say they hate school, there's some comfort in the monotony of the analytical subjects. You know exactly what you're bargaining for. There's no kind of illusion to any of it. You get what you pay for, I guess. And with art, kind of demystifying that and understanding the thing to be afraid of is really important. And I think art assessment is really important, and it isn't even in terms of like grading, it's more in terms of how well you are doing as a teacher and how well your students are doing as learners. Are they learning? Are they absorbing? Are you doing your best? Are you communicating well? I think assessment is more of just like a very concentrated form of communication, and in a way you're grading yourself because you're seeing how well you're doing in the classroom. And I think this chapter did a really good job in discussing how we play a role in the assessment and the students play a role in the assessment, and this was just a very holistic lesson on how assessments can interact in an art classroom. And I hope you enjoyed all of the commentary I provided to this reading, and I will see you again next one.